What happens when two of country music's biggest stars, who built their friendship on playful banter and mutual respect, find themselves in a moment so tense that the entire studio falls silent? What happens when that moment gets captured on camera, goes viral within hours, and leaves one of them looking absolutely blindsided? Before we get into this wild story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which team you're on, because trust me, you're going to have opinions about this one. Blake Shelton walked into that interview expecting another easy, fun conversation. He'd done hundreds of them, maybe thousands at this point. The man knows how to work a room, knows how to get a laugh, knows exactly when to flash that signature grin that's made him a household name. This was supposed to be a routine press junket, the kind of thing he could do in his sleep. A quick chat about his latest album, some jokes about life on the ranch, maybe a story or two about his time on The Voice. Easy money, easy content, easy day. Kelly Clarkson was already seated when he arrived, and that should have been his first clue that something was different about this particular interview. They'd done joint interviews before, plenty of them, but there was something in the air that morning. Maybe it was the way Kelly's smile didn't quite reach her eyes when she greeted him, or maybe it was the way she seemed more focused than usual, more locked in. Blake didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't think much of it. Why would he? This was Kelly, his friend, his former co-star, someone he'd shared countless inside jokes with over the years. The host, a younger guy with nervous energy and an obvious eagerness to make this interview memorable, started things off light enough. He asked Blake about his new music, about whether he missed being on television every week, about what it was like to step back from the constant grind of being a coach. Blake answered with his usual charm, leaning back in his chair, completely at ease. He made a joke about finally having time to actually enjoy his coffee in the morning without worrying about getting to set. Everyone laughed, including Kelly, but again, there was something slightly off about her laugh. It was performative in a way that Blake's wasn't. Then the host pivoted, and this is where things started to shift. He brought up something Blake had said in a recent podcast interview, a comment that had gotten some attention online but hadn't really blown up into anything major. Blake had been talking about success in the music industry, about what it takes to stay relevant, about the difference between artists who have longevity and artists who flame out after a hit or two. He'd said something along the lines of natural talent being great, but that it takes more than that. It takes understanding the business, understanding your brand, understanding how to play the game. Nothing too controversial on the surface, right? But here's the thing, and this is where Blake's trouble started. He'd specifically mentioned that some artists get opportunities handed to them, that they get platforms and exposure that others have to claw and fight for. And while he never named names, the implication was pretty clear if you read between the lines. He was talking about artists who came up through reality television. Artists who got famous not by touring dive bars and building a grassroots following, but by winning a competition on national television and getting launched straight to the top. The host, sensing an opportunity, decided to poke at this a little bit. He turned to Kelly with a grin and said something like, "So Kelly, you came up through American Idol. Does that mean Blake thinks your success was handed to you?" It was meant to be playful, meant to create a fun moment of fake tension that they could all laugh about. The host clearly expected Kelly to roll her eyes, make a joke, maybe fire back with some witty comeback about Blake's own career path. That's not what happened. Kelly turned to look directly at Blake, and the temperature in the room dropped. She didn't smile, she didn't laugh. She just looked at him with this incredibly steady gaze and said, "Is that what you think, Blake? Do you actually believe that?" Blake, still not quite reading the room, still thinking this was all part of the playful banter they'd always had, chuckled and said something like, "Come on, Kelly, you know what I meant." But Kelly wasn't letting it go. She leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the studio suddenly pay closer attention. She said, "No, actually, I don't know what you meant. Why don't you explain it to me?" You could feel the energy shift. The host's smile became a little more frozen, a little less natural. The camera operators glanced at each other. Blake's own smile started to falter just a bit around the edges. He tried to laugh it off again, tried to steer things back to safer territory, but Kelly wasn't having it. She kept her eyes on him and waited for an actual answer. Blake, now realizing this might not be the light-hearted exchange he thought it would be, started to explain himself. He said something about how he wasn't talking about her specifically, how he was just making a general observation about the industry, about different paths to success. He emphasized that she's obviously incredibly talented, that nobody could deny that her success speaks for itself. But even as he said it, you could hear him trying to backpedal, trying to soften what he'd said in that podcast without actually admitting he'd said anything wrong. Kelly nodded slowly as he talked, but there was no warmth in it. When he finished, she said, "So let me get this straight. You think that because I won a singing competition on television, my career was somehow easier than yours. You think that getting voted through week after week by millions of people, then having to prove myself with every single album afterward, that was the easy route." Blake started to respond, but Kelly kept going. She said, "You know what, Blake? Let's talk about platforms for a second. You were signed to a major label right out of the gate because you fit a certain image that country music was looking for at that exact moment. You had industry connections, you had people vouching for you. You had doors that opened because of who you knew and what you looked like. That's not a criticism, that's just a fact. But let's not pretend like you built everything from nothing while the rest of us just got lucky." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's face, usually so animated and expressive, went completely blank for a moment. He clearly had not expected this, had not seen it coming at all. The host looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair and disappear. Nobody knew quite what to say or do. This had gone from a friendly interview to something else entirely, and it had happened so fast that nobody had time to pump the brakes. Blake, to his credit, tried to recover. He said something about how he wasn't trying to diminish her accomplishments, about how he has nothing but respect for her. But his voice had lost that confident swagger, that easy charm. He sounded defensive now, almost a little hurt. He said, "Kelly, come on, we've been friends for years." You know, I didn't mean anything by it, and this is where Kelly really drove the point home. She said, "That's the problem, though, isn't it? You didn't mean anything by it. You just said it without thinking about how it sounds, without considering that maybe those kinds of comments have real impact. You've been able to say whatever you want for so long without anyone really pushing back. And now when someone does, you act like we're the ones being unreasonable." Blake sat there, and for the first time in probably his entire career in the public eye, he looked genuinely rattled. This wasn't playful ribbing between friends. This was Kelly holding up a mirror and making him look at something he'd probably never had to confront before. The power dynamic that everyone assumed existed, that Blake was the established star and Kelly was just his friend and former colleague, had completely flipped. In this moment, Kelly was in control, and Blake was scrambling. The host, desperately trying to salvage something from this train wreck, attempted to move on to another topic, but the damage was done. Blake tried to compose himself, tried to get back into his comfortable persona, but you could see it in his eyes. He was shaken. Kelly, meanwhile, answered the rest of the interview questions with perfect professionalism, but there was a satisfaction in her demeanor, a sense that she'd said something she'd been holding back for a while and was glad it was finally out there. When the interview finally wrapped, Blake stood up quickly, mumbled something about having another commitment, and left without the usual small talk and goodbyes. Kelly stayed to chat with the crew, seemingly unbothered, while Blake couldn't get out of there fast enough. Within hours, clips of the exchange started circulating online, and by that evening, it was everywhere. The clip that went viral wasn't even the full exchange. Someone had edited it down to just the most brutal moments. Kelly's pointed questions, Blake's fumbling responses, that long, awkward silence where you could see him trying to figure out how to respond without making things worse. The comments section exploded immediately. People were picking sides, dissecting every word, every facial expression, every pause. Some defended Blake, saying Kelly had overreacted, that she'd ambushed him over an offhand comment that didn't deserve that level of response. Others celebrated Kelly, saying she'd finally called out the kind of casual dismissiveness that successful women in the industry have to deal with constantly. But here's what made it so much worse for Blake. The context that people started digging up once the clip went viral, that podcast interview where he'd made the original comments, wasn't his first time touching on this topic. People started finding other interviews, other moments where Blake had made similar implications about different paths to success, about authenticity in country music, about paying dues. On their own, each comment seemed relatively harmless, just a guy sharing his perspective on the industry. But when you line them all up together, a pattern emerged. Blake had a habit of positioning himself as the more legitimate artist, the one who'd done things the right way, compared to others who'd taken shortcuts or gotten lucky breaks. And the thing is, Blake's own career path wasn't exactly the struggling artist narrative he sometimes implied it was. Yes, he'd played bars and worked his way up to a degree, but he'd also been signed to a major label in his early 20s, had significant industry support from day one, had benefited enormously from fitting the exact mold of what country radio wanted at that particular moment. None of that diminished his talent or his work ethic, but it did make his comments about others having advantages ring a little hollow. Kelly calling him out on it had exposed something that a lot of people were already thinking, but nobody had really said directly to his face before. Back in the studio, after Blake had left, Kelly was asked by one of the producers if she was okay. If that had gotten more intense than she'd intended, Kelly apparently smiled and said she was perfectly fine, that sometimes things need to be said, even if they're uncomfortable. She mentioned that she'd heard what Blake said on that podcast, that it had bothered her at the time, and when the host brought it up during the interview, she decided she wasn't going to just laugh it off like everyone probably expected her to. She'd spent too many years in this industry, watching men casually dismiss the accomplishments of women who'd worked just as hard, if not harder, and she was done pretending it didn't bother her. The host, still processing what had just happened, asked if she thought Blake understood why she'd responded the way she did. Kelly shrugged and said she hoped so, but that it wasn't really her job to make him comfortable with being challenged. She said that Blake's a grown man who's been in this business long enough to know that words matter, that when you have a platform and you use it to make generalizations about other people's careers, you should be prepared to have those generalizations questioned. Meanwhile, Blake was in his car, or maybe back at his hotel, watching his phone blow up. His team was definitely aware of what was happening by now. The clip had been picked up by entertainment news sites, by gossip blogs, by social media accounts with millions of followers. Everyone was talking about it. Blake Shelton, humiliated by Kelly Clarkson. Kelly Clarkson destroys Blake Shelton in interview. Blake Shelton left speechless after Kelly Clarkson confrontation. The headlines were brutal, and they all had one thing in common. They positioned Blake as the one who'd lost this exchange. Decisively, for someone who'd built a career, partly on being quick-witted, on always having the perfect comeback, on never being the butt of the joke for too long, this was probably devastating. Blake had always controlled his own narrative. Even when he'd gone through personal struggles or public breakups, he'd managed to come out looking sympathetic, or at least relatable. This was different. This was him being intellectually outmaneuvered, being called out on his own contradictions, and having no good response. This was him looking defensive and flustered, while Kelly remained calm and articulate. The contrast was stark, and the internet loves nothing more than a stark contrast. What Blake probably didn't expect was how many people in the industry would quietly side with Kelly, not publicly. Most people in entertainment are too smart to wade into something like this while it's still hot, but privately, there were a lot of conversations happening. A lot of artists, particularly women, who'd heard similar comments from Blake or from other men in the industry over the years, who'd smiled and nodded and not made waves, because that's what you do when you want to keep working. Kelly had said what a lot of them had been thinking, and there was a sense of satisfaction in seeing someone finally push back the next day. Blake's social media was noticeably quiet. Usually he's pretty active, posting about music or football or something happening on the ranch, interacting with fans. Nothing. Radio silence. His team was almost certainly figuring out how to handle this, whether to address it directly or let it blow over. Whether Blake should apologize or clarify, or just move on and hope people forget. But this wasn't the kind of thing that was going to blow over quickly. Not when the clip had already been viewed millions of times. Not when every entertainment show was playing it and bringing on commentators to analyze it. Kelly, on the other hand, posted something completely unrelated to the interview. Just normal content about her show, about a song she was working on. She didn't acknowledge the viral moment at all, which somehow made it even more powerful. She didn't need to. She'd said what she said. It had resonated with people, and she was moving on with her life. The confidence of that, the refusal to over-explain or apologize, just reinforced the impression that she'd been completely in the right during that exchange. By the third day, Blake still hadn't made any public statement about the interview. His representatives had given a bland comment to one outlet, Something about how Blake and Kelly have always had a relationship built on honesty, and that they respect each other's perspectives, the kind of corporate Nan statement that satisfies nobody. But Blake himself stayed quiet, which people interpreted in different ways. Some thought he was being mature, not feeding into the drama. Others thought he was hiding, licking his wounds, unsure how to address it without making things worse. Behind the scenes, there were apparently attempts to reach out to Kelly to smooth things over, to maybe coordinate some kind of joint statement that would put this to rest. But Kelly wasn't interested in making Blake feel better about what had happened. She wasn't angry, from what people close to her said. She just felt like the conversation had needed to happen, and now it had happened, and that was that. She wasn't going to help him save face, wasn't going to pretend it was all a misunderstanding, or that they'd talked it out and everything was fine. Sometimes things are uncomfortable. Sometimes people need to sit with that discomfort, and Kelly seemed perfectly content to let Blake sit with his dot. The think pieces started coming next. Articles about sexism in country music, about how women in the industry are constantly having their success questioned or attributed to luck or looks or connections, while men are assumed to have earned everything through pure talent and hard work. Articles about reality television and how winning a show like American Idol is actually an incredibly difficult thing to do, that it requires not just talent but consistency, likability, the ability to connect with an audience week after week under intense pressure. Articles pointing out that Kelly Clarkson has had one of the most successful and sustained careers of anyone from her generation of artists, that she's sold millions of albums, won multiple Grammys, had hit after hit, built a television career, and done it all while being constantly underestimated and having to prove herself over and over again. And then there were the articles about Blake, about how this moment revealed something about the way he views his own career versus others, about the blind spots that come with privilege, not privilege in some abstract political sense, but the specific privilege of being a man in country music, of fitting the image that the industry has always favored, of having doors open a little easier, of having your talent assumed rather than questioned. Nobody was saying Blake wasn't talented or hadn't worked hard, but Kelly had forced a reckoning with the idea that his path had been uniquely difficult, or that others had somehow had it easier. The longer Blake stayed quiet, the more the narrative solidified. Kelly had won this exchange, not just in the moment, but in the aftermath. She'd made a point that resonated, that got people thinking and talking, while Blake had been left looking like someone who'd been coasting on assumptions that couldn't hold up under scrutiny. For someone whose brand was built on being confident, funny, and always in control, this was a real crisis. How do you come back from looking intellectually outmatched? How do you recover when the person who called you out is someone you considered a friend, someone the public also loves and respects? Around day 5, Blake finally broke his silence, but not in the way anyone expected. He didn't post a lengthy apology or a defensive explanation. He didn't try to reframe what had happened or claim he'd been misunderstood. Instead, he showed up to another interview, a radio show this time, and the host immediately asked him about the viral moment with Kelly. You could see Blake take a breath, and for a second it looked like he might deflect, might try to laugh it off or change the subject, but he didn't. He said, "Look, I messed up. I said something without really thinking about how it would land, and Kelly had every right to call me out on it." He paused, and you could tell he was choosing his words carefully now, maybe for the first time in a long time. He continued, "I've been in this business long enough that I should know better. I should know that the things I say carry weight, especially when I'm talking about other people's careers, other people's journeys. Kelly worked her tail off to get where she is, and she's maintained that success for over 2 decades. That's not luck. That's not a platform being handed to someone. That's talent and dedication and consistency." The host tried to jump in, probably to soften it or move the conversation forward, but Blake kept going. He said, "The truth is, I think I've gotten comfortable saying whatever pops into my head because usually people just laugh or agree or let it slide. And maybe that's worked for me for a long time, but it doesn't make it right. Kelly didn't let it slide, and honestly, good for her. More people should push back when they hear something that doesn't sit right with them." It was the most genuine Blake had sounded in years, possibly ever in a public setting. There was no performance in it, no calculated charm. He actually sounded humbled, like someone who'd been forced to look at himself from an angle he'd never considered before and didn't love what he saw. He admitted that when Kelly started questioning him during that interview, his first instinct was to get defensive, to feel like he was being attacked. But afterward, once he'd had time to think about it, he realized she was right. He said he'd been operating under assumptions about his own career and other people's careers that he'd never really examined. And having those assumptions challenged publicly was uncomfortable, but probably necessary. The host asked if he'd talked to Kelly since the interview. Blake said he'd tried to reach out, but that he understood if she needed some space. He said he didn't expect her to make him feel better about the situation. That this wasn't about him needing reassurance or forgiveness. He said Kelly had said what she needed to say, and now it was on him to actually think about it and maybe do better going forward. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation story, wasn't even really closure, but it felt honest in a way that celebrity apologies rarely do. The thing is, even with Blake's response, even with him essentially admitting that Kelly had been right to confront him, the damage to his image was already done. The clip of the original exchange had been seen by tens of millions of people at this point. It had become one of those cultural moments that transcends just the entertainment world, the kind of thing people who don't even follow celebrity news had seen and had opinions about. Blake's follow-up comments got attention too, and some people gave him credit for owning up to it, but the dominant narrative was already set. Kelly had destroyed him in that interview, had left him stammering and defensive, and no amount of thoughtful reflection after the fact could erase that. For Kelly, this whole situation had done something interesting to her public perception. She'd always been well-liked, always been seen as talented and down-to-earth, but there was a new dimension to how people viewed her now. She wasn't just the nice, relatable celebrity anymore. She was someone who would stand up for herself, who wouldn't let things slide just to keep the peace, who was willing to make things awkward if it meant saying something that needed to be said. That kind of strength, especially coming from a woman in an industry that often rewards women for being accommodating and pleasant, resonated deeply with a lot of people. The interview itself became a teaching moment in a weird way. It got used in think pieces about workplace dynamics, about how to handle being challenged, about the difference between friendly banter and actually meaningful disagreement. Business publications wrote about it as an example of what happens when someone isn't prepared to defend their own statements under scrutiny. Entertainment journalists analyzed it as a shift in the power dynamics between celebrities who came up in different eras with different expectations about what they could say without pushback. It became bigger than just Blake and Kelly. It became a symbol of a changing culture, where assumptions that used to go unchallenged were suddenly fair game. Blake's team tried to move forward strategically. He did a few more interviews where he was noticeably more careful about how he talked about other artists, more generous in his praise, more thoughtful about not making sweeping generalizations. He posted on social media about other people's successes, congratulating artists on their achievements without any of the subtle qualifications he might have added before. It all felt a bit performative, like someone who'd been told by their publicist to rehabilitate their image. But maybe that was necessary. Maybe sometimes you need to consciously change your behavior before your actual thinking catches up. But here's the thing about public humiliation in the social media age. It lives forever. That clip of Kelly shutting Blake down wasn't going to disappear. It would come up every time someone made a list of the most awkward celebrity interview moments. It would get referenced in articles about both of their careers for years to come. It would be the thing people brought up at parties when Blake's name came up in conversation. Oh yeah, remember when Kelly Clarkson completely destroyed him in that interview? For someone who'd spent decades carefully crafting a public persona as the funny, confident guy who always had the upper hand, this was a permanent mark against that image. Kelly, meanwhile, just kept doing what she'd always done. She kept making music, kept doing her show, kept being the professional that she'd been for her entire career. She didn't gloat about the viral moment, didn't bring it up constantly or use it for clout. She'd said what she'd said, it had the impact it had, and she moved on. That restraint, that refusal to milk the moment for everything it was worth, somehow made the whole thing even more powerful. She hadn't been trying to create a viral moment or destroy Blake publicly. She'd just been responding honestly to something that bothered her. And the fact that it blew up the way it did said more about how ready people were to see that kind of confrontation than anything else. The relationship between Blake and Kelly, after all this, remained unclear. They didn't do any more joint interviews, didn't appear together publicly. Maybe they'd eventually find their way back to genuine friendship. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe some things, once said, change a dynamic permanently. But what was clear was that this moment had shifted something for both of them. Blake had been forced to confront aspects of his own privilege and perspective that he'd probably never thought much about before. Kelly had demonstrated that being liked doesn't mean you have to stay quiet when something bothers you. That sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is be honest, even when that honesty creates tension. Months later, when people talked about this interview, they still used words like humiliated and destroyed to describe what had happened to Blake. And maybe those words were too strong. Maybe what really happened was just an uncomfortable conversation, where one person was more prepared and more articulate than the other. But in the court of public opinion, in the world of viral clips and social media reactions, Blake had definitely lost. He'd walked into that interview expecting easy banter with a friend, and walked out looking like someone who'd been intellectually dismantled on camera. The fact that he eventually responded with some grace and self-reflection helped, but it didn't change the core reality of what millions of people had witnessed. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's that you can't coast on charm and likability forever. Maybe it's that assumptions you've never had to defend can crumble pretty quickly when someone actually pushes back. Maybe it's that the people you think will always laugh along with your jokes might one day decide they're tired of being the punchline. Or maybe it's just that in a world where everything is recorded and shared and analyzed, you better be prepared to stand behind everything you say, because eventually someone's going to ask you to explain yourself, and they might not accept your first answer. Blake Shelton learned that lesson the hard way, on camera, in front of millions of people, while Kelly Clarkson calmly and methodically took apart every defense he tried to offer. It was uncomfortable to watch, and it was probably even more uncomfortable to experience, but sometimes discomfort is the price of growth. Whether Blake actually grew from this experience, whether it changed how he thinks about his career and other people's careers, that's something only he knows. But what everyone knows is that on that particular day, in that particular interview, Kelly Clarkson said what needed to be said, and Blake Shelton had no good answer for it. If you made it this far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below.